The morning fog rolled across the manicured grounds of Whitlock Manor like a grey shroud, matching the sombre mood that had settled over Duke Henry Whitlock's perfectly ordered world. Standing at the tall windows of his study, he watched the approaching carriage with a mixture of resignation and anticipation that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. Today would mark the arrival of his intended bride, Miss Rosalind Moore, a woman he had never met but whose reputation for propriety and docility had made her the perfect choice for his carefully planned marriage. At 34, Henry possessed the kind of commanding presence that made lesser men step aside and society matrons compete for his attention. His dark auburn hair was always impeccably styled, his steel-grey eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing, and his bearing spoke of absolute confidence in his own authority and judgment. He had inherited the Duchy of Whitlock at the age of 28, when his father died in a hunting accident, and in the 6 years since, he had built a reputation as one of England's most formidable and uncompromising peers. Henry's approach to life was methodical, precise and utterly controlled. He ran his estates with military efficiency, conducted his business affairs with calculated precision, and maintained his social obligations with rigid adherence to protocol. His household operated like clockwork, his servants knew exactly what was expected of them, and his life proceeded according to carefully laid plans that left nothing to chance. The marriage he had arranged with Miss Moore was simply another aspect of his well-ordered existence. He needed a wife to secure his lineage and manage his social obligations, and she needed the security and position that marriage to a duke could provide. According to her guardian's letters, Miss Moore was a quiet, well-bred young woman of modest means, who understood her duty and would be grateful for the opportunity to become a duchess. She was, by all accounts, exactly the sort of biddable, proper wife who would complement his lifestyle without disrupting his carefully maintained equilibrium. What Henry had not anticipated was the woman who would step down from that carriage and turn his perfectly ordered world upside down. The carriage drew to a halt before the manor's grand entrance with a flourish that seemed somehow defiant, as if even the vehicle sensed the rebellious nature of its passenger. Henry straightened his cravat and prepared to greet his intended bride with the formal courtesy that the occasion demanded. He had planned their first meeting carefully, a brief, polite introduction in the drawing room, followed by tea and conversation that would establish the proper tone for their future relationship. Instead, what emerged from the carriage was a force of nature that seemed to bring chaos in her wake. Rosalind Moore was nothing like the demure, proper young lady Henry had expected. At 26, she possessed a wild beauty that was both striking and unsettling, auburn hair that seemed to have a life of its own, escaping from its pins in rebellious curls that caught the morning light like burnished copper. Her eyes were a startling shade of violet that seemed to hold depths of mischief and intelligence, and her features, while undeniably beautiful, carried an expression of determination and defiance that spoke of a woman who had never learned to be properly submissive. But it was not just her appearance that marked her as different from the bride Henry had expected. Everything about her bearing, from the way she surveyed the manor's imposing facade with apparent amusement rather than awe, to the manner in which she strode up the front steps as if she owned the place, suggested a woman who had never encountered a rule she didn't feel compelled to question. "Your Grace," she said, as she swept into the entrance hall, her voice carrying a musical quality that was both cultured and somehow wild. "I am Rosalind Moore, and I believe you are expecting me." Henry found himself momentarily speechless, not just by her unconventional beauty, but by the sheer force of personality that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a flame. This was not the quiet, grateful young woman he had been promised. This was something altogether more dangerous and unpredictable. "Miss Moore," he managed, his voice maintaining its usual controlled tone, despite his inner turmoil. "Welcome to Whitlock Manor. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Comfortable enough, though I must say your roads could use some attention," Rosalind replied with a directness that made Henry's eyebrows rise in surprise. "I counted no fewer than 6 potholes that nearly threw me from my seat. Surely a duke of your standing could arrange for better maintenance of the local infrastructure." Henry stared at her, unsure whether to be offended by her criticism or amazed by her audacity. In his experience, young women meeting him for the first time were either tongue-tied with nervousness or effusive with compliments. None had ever criticized his estate management within 5 minutes of arrival. "I shall look into the matter," he said carefully. "Perhaps you would care to refresh yourself after your journey. Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your rooms." "Actually, I would prefer to see the grounds first," Rosalind announced, already moving toward the door that led to the gardens. "I find that you can tell a great deal about a man by how he treats his land and his animals." "Miss Moore," Henry called after her, his voice carrying a note of authority that usually brought immediate compliance. "It would be more appropriate to—" But Rosalind was already through the door and striding across the terrace toward the gardens, leaving Henry to follow in her wake like a man chasing a whirlwind. As he hurried to catch up with her, he found himself wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. The tour of the grounds that followed was unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. Instead of the polite, appreciative comments he was accustomed to receiving from visitors, Rosalind subjected every aspect of his estate to intense scrutiny, offering suggestions for improvement with a confidence that was both impressive and infuriating. "Your rose garden is lovely, but you're planting them too close together," she observed, kneeling to examine the soil with a familiarity that suggested extensive gardening experience. "They need more room to breathe, and this soil is too acidic for optimal growth. Have you considered adding lime?" "I leave such matters to my head gardener," Henry replied stiffly, unused to having his estate management questioned by anyone, let alone a woman who was supposed to be his grateful and submissive bride. "Ah, but a true landowner should understand every aspect of his property," Rosalind said, rising and brushing dirt from her gloves with casual disregard for propriety. "How can you make informed decisions if you don't understand the fundamentals?" Henry found himself at a loss for words. Her criticism was not unfounded. He did tend to delegate such matters to his staff, but the casual way she pointed out his shortcomings was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Their tour continued to the stables, where Rosalind's behavior became even more unconventional. Instead of admiring the horses from a safe distance as any proper lady would, she immediately began examining them with the expertise of a seasoned horseman, running her hands along their legs, checking their teeth, and engaging the stable hands in detailed discussions about their care and training. "This mare has been favoring her left foreleg," she announced after examining a particularly fine chestnut. "When did she last see a farrier?" The head groom, a grizzled man named Thompson who had served the Whitlock family for 30 years, looked to Henry for guidance. No lady had ever questioned him about horse care before, and he seemed unsure how to respond. "Answer her," Henry said quietly, his curiosity beginning to overcome his shock at her unconventional behavior. "3 weeks ago, miss," Thompson replied cautiously, "but she's been fine since then." "Look at how she's standing," Rosalind said, pointing to the subtle way the mare was shifting her weight. "She's protecting that leg. It may not be serious, but it bears watching." Thompson examined the horse more carefully and nodded slowly. "You might be right, miss. I'll have the farrier take another look." Henry watched this exchange with growing amazement. Not only did Rosalind possess extensive knowledge about horses, but she had spotted something that his experienced staff had missed. It was impressive, but it was also deeply unsettling to a man who prided himself on maintaining absolute control over his domain. "Where did you acquire such knowledge of horses, Miss Moore?" he asked, as they walked back toward the manor. "My father bred horses before he died," Rosalind replied, her voice softening slightly at the mention of her parent. "I spent most of my childhood in the stables rather than the drawing room. My guardian considered it most improper, but I found horses far more interesting than embroidery or watercolors." "And your guardian allowed this unconventional education?" Rosalind's laugh was musical but held a note of bitterness. "My guardian, Lord Pemberton, tried his best to make me into a proper lady, but I'm afraid I was a great disappointment to him. I have opinions, you see, and I'm not very good at keeping them to myself. So I have observed," Henry said dryly. "Does that trouble you, Your Grace?" Rosalind asked, stopping to face him directly. "Because I should warn you that I am unlikely to change. I am not the sort of woman who can be molded into someone else's idea of perfection." Henry looked into her violet eyes and saw a challenge there, a defiance that both attracted and alarmed him. "And what sort of woman are you, Miss Moore?" "The sort who speaks her mind, who refuses to pretend ignorance to flatter male vanity, and who believes that a woman's worth should not be measured solely by her ability to be decorative and silent," Rosalind replied, with a directness that took his breath away. "I see," Henry said carefully. "And you believe such independence is compatible with marriage?" "I believe that a marriage between two intelligent people should be a partnership, not a dictatorship," Rosalind said firmly. "I have no desire to be a duke's ornament, Your Grace. If that is what you are seeking, then perhaps you should look elsewhere." Henry stared at her, his mind reeling from the implications of her words. Everything about this woman was the opposite of what he had expected, what he had planned for, what he thought he wanted. She was challenging, unpredictable, and utterly uncontrollable. She represented everything that could disrupt his carefully ordered existence. And yet, as he looked into her defiant violet eyes, he felt something stirring within him that he had not experienced in years. Genuine interest, intellectual stimulation, and something that might have been the beginning of attraction. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should continue this conversation over tea. I find myself curious to learn more about your unique perspective on marriage and partnership." Rosalind's smile was radiant, transforming her face from merely beautiful to absolutely stunning. "I would like that very much, Your Grace, though I should warn you that my opinions on most subjects are considered quite scandalous by polite society." "Miss Moore," Henry said with the first genuine smile he had worn in months, "I am beginning to suspect that scandalous might be exactly what my life has been missing." As they walked back to the manor together, Henry found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about marriage, partnership, and what he truly wanted from life. The proper, docile bride he had expected would have been easy to manage, predictable to live with, and utterly forgettable. But the untamed woman walking beside him promised something far more challenging and infinitely more interesting. He had expected a simple, proper bride, but the woman who had arrived was anything but simple. She was complex, intelligent, passionate, and utterly unafraid to challenge his authority and assumptions. She represented everything that could disrupt his carefully controlled world, and for the first time in his adult life, Henry found himself wondering if disruption might be exactly what he needed. The collision of worlds. The afternoon tea that followed their unconventional tour of the grounds proved to be unlike any social gathering Henry had ever hosted. Instead of the polite, predictable conversation he was accustomed to, he found himself engaged in a spirited debate that ranged from estate management to political philosophy, from literature to social reform. Rosalind had changed from her traveling dress into a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her unusual coloring, but her attire was the only conventional thing about her presence in his drawing room. She sat with perfect posture, poured tea with practiced grace, and observed all the proper forms of etiquette, yet somehow managed to make even these mundane activities seem like acts of subtle rebellion. "You mentioned that you have opinions on most subjects," Henry said, as he accepted his cup of tea, his grey eyes studying her with growing fascination. "I confess myself curious about your views on the current state of agricultural reform." Most ladies of his acquaintance would have demurred, claiming ignorance of such masculine concerns. Rosalind, however, leaned forward with obvious interest, her violet eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "I believe the current system is fundamentally flawed," she said without hesitation. "The enclosure movements have displaced thousands of small farmers while concentrating land ownership in the hands of a few wealthy landowners. The result has been increased efficiency for some, but tremendous hardship for many." Henry's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You speak as if you have personal experience with these matters." "I do," Rosalind replied firmly. "Before my father's death, I often accompanied him when he visited his tenants. I saw firsthand how changes in agricultural practices affected real families, real lives. Too many landowners make decisions based solely on profit margins without considering the human cost." "And what would you propose as an alternative?" Henry asked, genuinely curious about her answer. "Our system that balances efficiency with compassion," Rosalind said immediately. "Landowners should invest in education and training for their tenants, helping them adapt to new methods rather than simply displacing them. They should also ensure that any improvements to the land benefit everyone involved, not just the estate owners." Henry found himself leaning forward, drawn into the conversation despite his initial intention to maintain polite distance. "You speak of landowners as if they have moral obligations beyond simple business considerations." "Don't they?" Rosalind challenged, her eyes flashing with passion. "With great power comes great responsibility, does it not? A duke like yourself controls the livelihoods of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. Surely that creates obligations beyond mere profit." "I have always endeavored to be a fair landlord," Henry said, though he found himself questioning whether fairness was sufficient. "Fair perhaps, but are you engaged?" Rosalind pressed. "Do you know your tenants by name? Do you understand their struggles, their hopes, their fears? Or do you simply review reports from your stewards and make decisions from the comfort of your study?" The question hit closer to home than Henry cared to admit. His management style was indeed distant and impersonal, based on efficiency and profit, rather than personal connection. He had always considered this a strength, a sign of his rational approach to business, but Rosalind's challenge made him wonder if he had been missing something important. You seem to have strong opinions about how estates should be managed, he said carefully. Have you considered that such hands-on involvement might not be appropriate for a duchess? Rosalind's laugh was musical but held a sharp edge. Appropriate according to whom, Your Grace? Society's arbitrary rules about what women should and shouldn't do. I believe a duchess has the same moral obligations as a duke to use her position and influence to improve the lives of those under her care. And if your husband disagreed with your involvement in estate matters, then I would hope he would be intelligent enough to listen to reasoned arguments and compassionate enough to care about the welfare of his people, Rosalind replied without hesitation. A marriage should be a partnership, Your Grace, not a dictatorship. Henry set down his teacup with deliberate care, his mind racing as he tried to process this extraordinary woman's views on marriage and partnership. Everything she said challenged his fundamental assumptions about how relationships between men and women should function. Miss Moore, he said slowly, I believe you may be the most unconventional woman I have ever encountered. Is that a compliment or a criticism? Rosalind asked with a slight smile. I'm not entirely certain, Henry admitted with surprising honesty. You are nothing like what I expected in a wife. And what did you expect, Your Grace? Henry considered the question seriously. Someone quiet, agreeable, content to manage household affairs while leaving all important decisions to me. Someone who would be grateful for the security and position that marriage to a duke could provide. Someone who would never challenge you, never disagree with you, never force you to question your assumptions or examine your beliefs, Rosalind said, with understanding that was both gentle and pointed. Precisely, Henry said, then paused as he realized how that sounded. Though when you put it that way, it sounds rather limiting. It sounds lonely, Rosalind said softly, her violet eyes showing a flash of sympathy. A marriage without intellectual companionship, without genuine partnership, without the possibility of growth and change, what kind of life would that be? Henry found himself without an answer. He had always viewed marriage as a practical arrangement, a necessary duty that would provide him with heirs and social stability. The idea that it could be something more, a source of intellectual stimulation, emotional connection, and personal growth, had never occurred to him. You speak as if you have given considerable thought to marriage, he observed. I have had little choice but to think about it, Rosalind replied with a slight bitterness. As an orphan with a modest inheritance, marriage is essentially my only option for security, but I refuse to accept that security must come at the cost of my identity or my principles. And if your husband demanded such sacrifices, then I would have to decide whether security was worth the price of my soul, Rosalind said simply. I hope I would have the courage to choose integrity over comfort. Henry stared at her, struck by the quiet dignity with which she spoke of potentially sacrificing her own security for her principles. It was a kind of courage he rarely encountered, especially among the women of his social circle, who seemed primarily concerned with advantageous marriages and social position. Miss Moore, he said carefully, I believe I owe you an apology. For what, Your Grace? For assuming that you would be grateful for any arrangement I might offer, regardless of the terms. For treating this marriage as a business transaction rather than a partnership between two intelligent people. Rosalind's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. That is very gracious of you to say, Your Grace, though I should point out that we have not yet agreed to any marriage at all. Have we not? Henry asked, surprised by his own reluctance to see her leave. You expected a simple, proper bride who would fit neatly into your ordered life, Rosalind said with gentle amusement. I am neither simple nor particularly proper, and I have no intention of fitting neatly into anyone's preconceived notions. The question is whether you are prepared to accept a wife who will challenge you, disagree with you, and refuse to be molded into your ideal of feminine perfection. Henry looked into her violet eyes and felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the rigid control he had maintained over his emotions for so many years. This woman represented everything that could disrupt his carefully ordered existence, everything that could challenge his authority and upset his plans. And yet, for the first time in his adult life, he found himself excited by the possibility of disruption, intrigued by the prospect of challenge, and attracted to the idea of a partnership that would force him to grow and change. Miss Moore, he said slowly, I believe I am beginning to realize that what I thought I wanted and what I actually need may be two entirely different things. And what do you think you need, Your Grace? Someone who will make me a better man, Henry said, with surprising honesty. Someone who will challenge me to be more than I am, to care about more than profit and efficiency and social position. And you think I might be that person? "I think," Henry said, rising and moving to stand before her chair, "that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met. I think that you have already made me question assumptions I have held for years, and I think that a marriage between us would be anything but simple or predictable." Rosalind looked up at him, her violet eyes searching his face for signs of sincerity. "Are you prepared for anything but simple and predictable, Your Grace?" "I don't know," Henry admitted with an honesty that surprised them both, "but I know that I want to find out. Will you give me the chance to discover what kind of husband I might become with the right partner?" Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, considering his words and the implications of her answer. "I will stay for a week," she said finally. "1 week for us to learn whether we can build something meaningful together, whether we can create a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. And if we cannot, then I will return to my guardian's house, and you can find yourself a simple, proper bride who will never trouble you with inconvenient opinions or challenging questions." Henry extended his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her gloved fingers in his palm. "1 week, then," he said solemnly. "1 week to discover whether the Duke of Whitlock is capable of change, and whether Miss Rosalind Moore is willing to take a chance on an imperfect man who is finally ready to learn what it means to be a true partner." As their hands touched, Henry felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with static, and everything to do with the recognition that his life was about to change in ways he could not predict or control. The untamed woman who had arrived at his door had already begun to transform him, and he found himself both terrified and exhilarated by the possibilities that lay ahead. He had expected a simple, proper bride, but the woman who had come to him was anything but simple. She was complex, challenging, passionate, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind. She represented everything that could disrupt his ordered existence, and for the first time in his life, Henry found himself hoping that disruption was exactly what he needed. The awakening. The week that followed Rosalind's arrival at Whitlock Manor proved to be unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. Each day brought new revelations about his unconventional guest, and each evening found him questioning assumptions he had held for decades about marriage, partnership, and what it truly meant to live rather than merely exist. Rosalind had been given the Blue Suite, a magnificent set of rooms that had traditionally housed the most honored female guests of the Whitlock family. But instead of remaining sequestered in feminine pursuits as most ladies would, she had made it clear from the first morning that she intended to involve herself in every aspect of estate life. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said brightly as she entered the breakfast room on her second day, dressed in a practical riding habit that suggested she had plans beyond decorative activities. Henry looked up from his correspondence, noting with a mixture of admiration and trepidation the determined gleam in her violet eyes. "Good morning, Miss Moore. I trust you slept well." "Wonderfully, thank you. I was hoping you might show me more of the estate today. Yesterday's tour was fascinating, but I feel I've only scratched the surface." "What particular aspects interest you?" Henry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything," Rosalind replied with enthusiasm. "The tenant farms, the village, the local school, if there is one. I want to understand how this estate truly functions, not just how it appears from the manor house." Henry set aside his letters with deliberate care. "Miss Moore, I should point out that such comprehensive involvement is not typically expected of a duchess." "Perhaps that's part of the problem," Rosalind replied, helping herself to breakfast with the unself-conscious ease that characterized everything she did. "How can someone make informed decisions about an estate if they don't understand how their choices affect the people who live and work on it?" "I receive regular reports from my stewards," Henry said, though even as he spoke the words they sounded inadequate. "Reports tell you what your employees think you want to hear," Rosalind observed. "They don't tell you what a tenant farmer's wife thinks about the condition of her cottage, or whether the village children are receiving adequate education, or how the elderly are cared for when they can no longer work." Henry found himself without a ready response. The truth was that he had never considered such matters in personal terms. His approach to estate management was efficient and profitable, but he was beginning to realize it might also be coldly impersonal. "Very well," he said finally. "We shall tour the tenant farms today, but I should warn you that conditions may not be as refined as you are accustomed to." Rosalind's laugh was musical and slightly mischievous. "Your Grace, I spent my childhood mucking out stables and helping with harvest. I believe I can handle a little rural reality." The tour that followed opened Henry's eyes to aspects of his own estate that he had never truly seen. Rosalind approached each tenant family with genuine interest and warmth, asking questions about their lives, their challenges, and their hopes for the future. She admired the women's gardens, played with their children, and listened to their concerns with an attention that was both respectful and engaged. "Mrs. Patterson," she said to the wife of one of his tenant farmers, "your vegetable garden is magnificent. Have you considered selling your surplus at the local market?" The woman, who had been tongue-tied in Henry's presence, relaxed visibly when speaking to Rosalind. "Oh, miss, I wouldn't know how to go about such a thing, and the market is a day's journey from here." "Perhaps His Grace might consider organizing a weekly market day in the village," Rosalind suggested, glancing meaningfully at Henry. "It would provide additional income for the tenants and fresh produce for the manor." Henry found himself nodding, though he had never considered such an arrangement before. "It's an interesting idea. I shall look into the practicalities." As they continued their tour, Henry watched Rosalind interact with his tenants and began to see his estate through her eyes. Where he saw efficiency and productivity, she saw people with individual stories, struggles, and dreams. Where he saw problems to be solved through administrative directives, she saw opportunities for community building and mutual support. "The village school is in terrible condition," she observed as they examined the small building where local children received their limited education. "The roof leaks, there are no proper books, and one teacher is trying to manage children of all ages. Education is not typically a priority for farming families," Henry replied, though he was beginning to question this assumption as well. "It should be," Rosalind said firmly. "Education is the key to improving their circumstances, to giving them choices beyond subsistence farming. And it benefits the estate as well. Educated tenants are more productive, more innovative, more capable of adapting to changing conditions." "You speak as if you have experience with educational matters." "I taught the children on my father's estate," Rosalind said simply. "It was one of the few ways I was allowed to be useful. I found it incredibly rewarding to watch young minds develop and grow." Henry stared at her, adding this revelation to the growing list of ways in which she defied his expectations. "Your guardian approved of such unconventional activities?" "My guardian disapproved of most of my activities," Rosalind replied with a slight smile. "But he found it difficult to argue against Christian charity, especially when it kept me occupied and out of more serious trouble." "What sort of trouble?" Henry asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to know the answer. "Oh, the usual sort that befalls young women with too much curiosity and too little supervision," Rosalind said airily. "Reading books I wasn't supposed to read, asking questions I wasn't supposed to ask, expressing opinions I wasn't supposed to have. Such as wondering why women are considered incapable of understanding politics when they're perfectly capable of managing households, or why a woman's virtue is measured by her ignorance rather than her character, or why society considers it more scandalous for a woman to speak her mind than for a man to abuse his power." Henry felt a familiar stirring of something that might have been excitement or alarm. He was no longer certain there was a difference when it came to Rosalind Moore. "And what conclusions did you reach regarding these philosophical inquiries?" "That most of society's rules about women are designed to maintain male authority rather than to protect female virtue," Rosalind said, with a directness that took his breath away. "That intelligence and independence are not character flaws to be suppressed, but gifts to be cultivated, and that any man who requires his wife to be ignorant and submissive is probably not confident enough in his own abilities to handle an equal partner." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and Henry found himself responding to it with a mixture of defensiveness and grudging admiration. "And you believe that marriage should be a partnership between equals?" "I believe that marriage should be a partnership between two people who respect each other's intelligence, value each other's contributions, and work together toward common goals," Rosalind replied. "Whether they are technically equal in the eyes of the law is less important than whether they treat each other as equals in practice." "That is a rather radical view of marriage, is it?" Rosalind asked with genuine curiosity. "Or is it simply a practical one? Think about it, Your Grace. Would you rather have a wife who blindly follows your orders without understanding their purpose, or one who understands your goals and can help you achieve them more effectively?" Henry considered the question seriously as they rode back toward the manor. The truth was that he had never thought about marriage in terms of partnership or collaboration. He had always assumed that a wife's role was to manage domestic affairs while he handled all matters of real importance. But watching Rosalind interact with his tenants, seeing how her genuine interest and practical suggestions had already identified several ways to improve estate operations, he was beginning to realize that he might have been limiting himself by limiting his expectations of what a wife could contribute. "Miss Moore," he said as they dismounted in the stable yard, "I believe you may be the most dangerous woman I have ever encountered." "Dangerous how?" Rosalind asked with amusement. "Dangerous to my peace of mind, my settled convictions, and my carefully ordered existence," Henry replied with surprising honesty. "You have been here 2 days, and already you have me questioning assumptions I have held for decades. Is that necessarily a bad thing?" Henry looked into her violet eyes and felt that now familiar stirring of something that might have been anticipation or terror. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I find myself curious to discover the answer." That evening, as they dined together in the Manor's elegant dining room, Henry found himself engaging in the kind of wide-ranging conversation he had not enjoyed in years. Rosalind's intelligence was matched by her curiosity, her passion by her practicality, and her unconventional views by her genuine desire to make a positive difference in the world. "Tell me about your childhood," he said, as they shared a bottle of wine that had somehow made the conversation flow more freely than usual. "It was unconventional, to say the least," Rosalind replied, with a smile that held both fondness and sadness. "My mother died when I was very young, and my father was, well, he was more interested in horses than in social conventions. I spent most of my time outdoors, learning about animals and farming and the practical aspects of estate management. And when your father died, I was 16 and suddenly found myself under the guardianship of a man who was horrified by my lack of feminine accomplishments," Rosalind said with a rueful laugh. "Lord Pemberton spent the next 10 years trying to transform me into a proper lady, with limited success." "What sort of transformation did he attempt?" "The usual sort: deportment lessons, instruction in watercolors and French, endless lectures on the importance of feminine modesty and submission. He hired a series of governesses who were tasked with suppressing my natural curiosity and teaching me to be decorative rather than useful." "And did they succeed?" "They succeeded in teaching me to hide my true nature when necessary," Rosalind said, with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "But they could not change who I fundamentally am. I remained curious, opinionated, and utterly incapable of pretending to be something I'm not for extended periods." "Is that why you are still unmarried at 26? Henry asked gently. Rosalind's expression grew more serious. "Partly. I had several suitors over the years, but they all wanted the decorative lady my guardian tried to create, not the real woman underneath. When they discovered my true nature, they invariably decided I was unsuitable for marriage." "Their loss," Henry said with surprising vehemence. "Perhaps," Rosalind said softly, "but it left me in a difficult position. My inheritance is modest, and my guardian made it clear that he would not continue to support me indefinitely. Marriage became a necessity rather than a choice. And yet you are here, challenging me at every turn rather than trying to make yourself agreeable," Henry observed. "Why?" Rosalind was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Because I decided that if I must marry for security, I would at least be honest about who I am. If you cannot accept me as I truly am, then our marriage would be a misery for both of us. Better to discover that now than after we are bound together for life." Henry felt something shift in his chest as he looked at this remarkable woman who was willing to risk her security for the sake of authenticity. "And if I can accept you as you are, then perhaps we might build something extraordinary together," Rosalind said, her violet eyes bright with possibility. "A partnership that challenges us both to be better than we are alone." As the evening drew to a close, and they prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Henry found himself reluctant to end their conversation. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, intellectually stimulated and emotionally engaged. "Miss Moore," he said as they paused outside her door, "I want you to know that these past 2 days have been illuminating." "In what way?" "You have shown me aspects of my own estate that I had never truly seen, challenged me to think about my responsibilities in ways I had never considered, and made me realize that what I thought I wanted in a wife was perhaps not what I actually needed." "And what do you think you need, Your Grace?" Henry looked into her eyes and felt the last of his carefully maintained emotional barriers beginning to crumble. "I think I need someone who will make me a better man," he said honestly. "Someone who will challenge me to care about more than efficiency and profit, who will help me see the human cost of my decisions, and who will refuse to let me hide behind duty and protocol when compassion is required." "That sounds like a great deal to ask of one person," Rosalind said gently. "Perhaps," Henry agreed, "but I believe you might be equal to the task." Rosalind's smile was radiant. "And I believe you might be worth the effort, Your Grace. Good night." As Henry made his way to his own chambers, he reflected on the extraordinary transformation that was taking place within him. The untamed woman who had arrived at his door was indeed changing his life forever, but not in the ways he had feared. Instead of bringing chaos and disruption, she was bringing clarity and purpose. Instead of challenging his authority, she was helping him understand what true leadership meant. He had expected a simple, proper bride who would fit neatly into his ordered existence. Instead, he had found a complex, passionate woman who was forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about marriage, partnership, and what it meant to truly live. And for the first time in his adult life, Henry found himself grateful for the unexpected, excited by the unknown, and eager to discover what other transformations lay ahead. The transformation. The third day of Rosalind's stay dawned with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mirror the growing heat of the attraction building between the Duke and his unconventional guest. Henry found himself rising earlier than usual, eager to continue the conversations and discoveries that had marked their time together thus far. He discovered Rosalind in the estate's kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt beside Mrs. Crawford, the head cook, examining the herb beds with the focused attention of someone who understood both the practical and medicinal uses of plants. "Your rosemary is magnificent, Mrs. Crawford," Rosalind was saying as Henry approached, "but you might consider planting some lavender nearby. It helps repel insects naturally and can be used for both cooking and household purposes." Mrs. Crawford, a woman who had served the Whitlock family for 20 years and was notoriously resistant to suggestions from outsiders, was nodding enthusiastically. "Oh, miss, that's a wonderful idea. And would you know anything about treating the blight that's been affecting our tomatoes?" "Actually, yes," Rosalind replied, moving to examine the affected plants. "This looks like early blight. You'll want to remove all the affected leaves immediately and burn them. Don't compost them, as that will spread the disease. Then create a spray with baking soda and water to treat the remaining plants." Henry watched this exchange with growing amazement. Not only did Rosalind possess extensive knowledge about gardening and plant diseases, but she had somehow managed to win over his notoriously particular cook in the space of a single morning. "Good morning, Miss Moore," he said, announcing his presence. "I see you've been making yourself useful." Rosalind looked up from the tomato plants, her face flushed with exertion and enthusiasm, dirt smudged on her cheek in a way that somehow made her more beautiful rather than less. "Good morning, Your Grace. Mrs. Crawford has been showing me your kitchen garden. It's quite impressive, though there are a few improvements that might increase both yield and variety." "Such as?" Henry asked, genuinely curious. "Companion planting, for one thing," Rosalind said, rising and brushing dirt from her hands. "Certain plants grow better together. They can share nutrients, repel pests, or provide beneficial shade. And you have space for a much larger herb garden, which could supply both the kitchen and a small still room for making household remedies." "You know about making household remedies?" Henry asked. "My father's housekeeper taught me," Rosalind replied. "It's a useful skill, especially on an estate where the nearest physician might be hours away. Simple remedies for common ailments can make a significant difference in people's lives." Mrs. Crawford beamed at this suggestion. "Oh, Your Grace, that would be wonderful. We haven't had a proper still room since your dear mother passed, God rest her soul." Henry felt a pang at the mention of his mother, who had indeed maintained an extensive still room and had been known throughout the county for her herbal remedies. After her death, he had ordered the still room closed, unable to bear the memories it contained. "I hadn't considered reopening the still room," he said carefully. "Perhaps it's time," Rosalind said gently, her violet eyes showing understanding of the emotions behind his reluctance. "Your mother's knowledge shouldn't be lost forever. And think of how much good it could do for your tenants and staff." Henry found himself nodding slowly. "You would be willing to... That is, do you have sufficient knowledge to..." "I would be honored to help restore your mother's still room," Rosalind said softly, "if you would trust me with such an important task." The simple offer touched something deep within Henry's carefully guarded heart. The still room had been his mother's domain, her special place where she had worked to heal and help others. The idea of Rosalind taking on that role, of breathing life back into that abandoned space, felt both right and terrifying. "We shall discuss it," he said finally. "But first, I believe you mentioned wanting to visit the village school yesterday." Rosalind's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Yes, I've been thinking about what we saw there, and I have some ideas about improvements that might be implemented without enormous expense." The ride to the village gave Henry an opportunity to observe Rosalind in yet another context. She rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent countless hours on horseback, her seat elegant but practical, her control of her mount absolute. She had chosen to ride astride rather than side-saddle, a choice that would have scandalized most of London society, but which seemed perfectly natural in the countryside. "You ride very well," Henry observed as they cantered across a meadow. "My father believed that anyone who owned horses should know how to ride them properly," Rosalind replied, her auburn hair escaping from its pins in the wind. "He said that side-saddles were an invention of men who were more concerned with women's appearance than their safety." "A practical philosophy," Henry said, finding himself admiring not just her skill, but her complete lack of self-consciousness about her unconventional choice. "My father was a practical man in most things," Rosalind said with a fond smile. "He believed that knowledge and skill were more valuable than adherence to arbitrary social conventions. Is that where you learned your independent thinking?" "Partly," Rosalind admitted, "but I think some of it is simply my nature. I've never been able to accept something simply because that's how it's always been done. I need to understand the reasoning behind rules and traditions. And when you find the reasoning inadequate, then I feel compelled to suggest improvements," Rosalind said with a grin that was both mischievous and determined, "much to the despair of my various governesses and my guardian." The village school proved to be even more depressing upon closer inspection than it had appeared from a distance. The building was small, cramped, and poorly maintained, with a leaking roof that had created water damage throughout. The single teacher, a harried-looking woman in her 50s named Miss Hartwell, was attempting to manage children ranging in age from 5 to 14, with no books, no supplies, and no support. "Miss Hartwell," Henry said as they entered the classroom, "may I present Miss Moore? She has some experience with education and was hoping to observe your methods." Miss Hartwell curtsied nervously, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected visit from the Duke. "Your Grace, Miss Moore, you are most welcome, though I fear there is little to see. We make do as best we can with what we have." Rosalind moved through the classroom with the same focused attention she had brought to every other aspect of the estate, examining the conditions, speaking gently with the children, and assessing the educational challenges with a practical eye. "How many children do you typically have in attendance?" she asked Miss Hartwell. "It varies with the seasons, miss. During planting and harvest, many of the older children are needed at home, but on average perhaps 20 to 25. And you manage all age groups simultaneously?" "I do my best, miss, but it's difficult to give proper attention to the youngest ones, while also preparing the older children for confirmation and basic arithmetic." Rosalind nodded sympathetically. "What would help you most in your work here?" Miss Hartwell looked nervously at Henry before answering. "Well, miss, if I might be so bold, books would be wonderful. We have only 2 primers for all the children, and no slates for writing practice. And the roof, well, when it rains, we can barely conduct lessons at all." "What about assistance?" Rosalind asked. "Would it help to have someone work with the younger children while you focus on the older ones?" "Oh, miss, that would be a blessing. But there's no money for another teacher, and most of the village women can't read well enough themselves to help with instruction." Henry watched this conversation with growing discomfort. The conditions in his village school were clearly inadequate, and he was beginning to realize that his benign neglect of educational matters had real consequences for real children. "Miss Hartwell," he said suddenly, "what would you need to make this school truly effective? Money aside, what would an ideal educational facility look like?" Miss Hartwell's eyes widened with surprise at being asked for her professional opinion. "Well, Your Grace, ideally we would have a larger building with separate rooms for different age groups. We would need books, slates, paper, and ink for all the children, and we would need at least one assistant teacher to help manage the different levels of instruction." "And what about more advanced education?" Rosalind asked. "Are there children here who show particular aptitude and might benefit from additional instruction?" "Oh yes, miss. Young Tommy Patterson is quite gifted with numbers, and Sarah Mills reads better than children twice her age, but there's nowhere for them to go beyond what I can teach here." Henry found himself thinking about the children they had met on their tour of the tenant farms. Bright, curious young people whose potential was being limited by circumstances beyond their control. For the first time, he began to understand Rosalind's point about education being the key to improving people's circumstances. "Miss Moore," he said as they prepared to leave the school, "you mentioned having ideas for improvements. What would you suggest?" Rosalind's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Several things, actually. First, the immediate needs, roof repair, books, and basic supplies. Those are relatively simple matters of funding, but beyond that, I think we could create something truly special here." such as a lending library for the families so that education could continue at home, practical instruction in addition to basic literacy, things like improved farming techniques, basic accounting, and household management, and perhaps most importantly, a system to identify and nurture the most gifted students, possibly even providing scholarships for further education. Henry stared at her, struck by the comprehensiveness of her vision. You've given this considerable thought. I've had 10 years to think about what I would do if I ever had the resources and authority to make a real difference, Rosalind said simply. Education is the foundation of everything else. Economic improvement, social progress, individual fulfillment. Invest in education, and you invest in the future. And you believe such extensive reforms would be worthwhile? I believe they would be transformative, Rosalind said with quiet passion. Not just for the children, but for the entire community. Educated people make better decisions, solve problems more effectively, and contribute more to society. They also tend to be more prosperous, which benefits everyone. As they rode back to the manor, Henry found himself grappling with a fundamental shift in his understanding of his role as a landowner. He had always seen his responsibilities in terms of maintaining profitable operations and fulfilling his legal obligations to his tenants. But Rosalind was challenging him to think about leadership in terms of human development and community building. Miss Moore, he said as they approached the manor, I find myself curious about something. Yes? You speak with such passion about education and social improvement, yet you have been forced to consider marriage for financial security. Do you not find that contradictory? Rosalind was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. I find it frustrating, she said finally. I have ideas, energy, and knowledge that I believe could make a real difference in the world, but as an unmarried woman with limited resources, I have very little power to implement those ideas. Marriage, for all its limitations, offers the possibility of influence and resources that I could never achieve on my own. And if your husband disagreed with your reformist tendencies, then I would have to decide whether the security of marriage was worth the frustration of being unable to act on my convictions, Rosalind said honestly. It's not an easy choice, but it's the reality of being a woman in our society. Henry felt a surge of something that might have been protectiveness or admiration, or perhaps both. And what if your husband supported your reformist tendencies? What if he saw them as assets rather than problems? Rosalind turned to look at him directly, her violet eyes searching his face. Then I would consider myself the most fortunate woman in England, she said softly. To have both security and the freedom to make a difference, that would be beyond my wildest dreams. That evening, as they dined together in the manor's elegant dining room, Henry found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Miss Moore, he said as they shared dessert and wine, I have been thinking about our conversation regarding the village school. Oh? Rosalind looked up with interest. I would like to implement your suggestions, Henry said simply. All of them. The roof repair, the books and supplies, the additional teacher, the lending library, everything you mentioned. Rosalind's face lit up with joy and amazement. Truly? You would be willing to make such an investment? I would be willing to make such an investment if you would be willing to oversee the project, Henry said, his heart racing as he made the offer. I realize it would be a significant undertaking requiring considerable time and attention. I would be honored, Rosalind said immediately. But such a project would take months, perhaps years to complete properly. Are you certain you want someone like me involved in your estate affairs for such an extended period? Henry looked into her violet eyes and felt the last of his resistance crumble. Miss Moore, I am beginning to realize that someone like you is exactly what my estate affairs have been missing. You see possibilities where I see only problems, opportunities where I see only obligations. You care about people in ways that I have forgotten how to care. Your Grace, Henry, he said suddenly, if we are to work together on this project, if we are to be partners in this endeavor, I would like you to call me Henry. Rosalind's smile was radiant. Henry, she said, testing the name. And you must call me Rosalind. Rosalind, Henry repeated, finding that he loved the way her name felt on his tongue. There is something else I wanted to discuss with you. Yes? Your suggestion about reopening my mother's still room. I would like to do that as well. If you would be willing to take on that responsibility. Rosalind's eyes filled with tears of joy. Oh, Henry, truly? You would trust me with something so important to your family's history? I would trust you with far more than that, Henry said, his voice rough with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. Rosalind, These past few days have shown me that everything I thought I wanted from life was merely the shadow of what I actually needed. What do you mean? I thought I wanted order, control, predictability. I thought I wanted a wife who would never challenge me or force me to question my assumptions. But you have shown me that such a life would be empty, meaningless, a waste of whatever gifts and opportunities I have been given. Henry rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. Rosalind, I know we have known each other for only a few days, but I feel as though you have awakened something in me that I didn't even know was sleeping. You have made me want to be a better man, a better leader, a better human being. Henry, I am asking you to marry me, he said simply. Not because it was arranged, not because it is convenient, but because I cannot imagine building the life I now want to live without you beside me as my partner, my equal, my wife. Rosalind looked into his eyes and saw something that took her breath away. Not just desire or affection, but genuine respect, admiration, and the beginning of something that might grow into love. Are you certain? She asked softly. I am not the simple, proper bride you expected. I will challenge you, disagree with you, force you to see the world in ways that may be uncomfortable. Are you truly prepared for a lifetime of that? I am not just prepared for it, Henry said with a smile that transformed his entire face. I am eager for it. Rosalind, you have shown me that the most important growth happens when we are challenged, when we are forced to move beyond our comfortable assumptions and embrace new possibilities. And you believe we could build something meaningful together, a true partnership? I believe we have already begun to build it, Henry said firmly. These past few days have shown me what we could accomplish together, the good we could do, the lives we could improve, the legacy we could leave. I want that future, Rosalind. I want it with you. Rosalind felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that her greatest hopes were about to be fulfilled. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Henry, I will marry you. I will be your partner, your equal, your wife. When Henry's lips met hers, the kiss was everything their brief acquaintance had promised, and more. It was passionate but tender, claiming but respectful, a kiss that spoke of partnership freely chosen rather than duty reluctantly accepted. As they held each other in the candlelit dining room of Whitlock Manor, both knew that their lives had been forever changed by their unexpected encounter. Henry had expected a simple, proper bride who would fit neatly into his ordered existence. Instead, he had found a complex, passionate woman who had challenged everything he thought he knew about marriage, leadership, and what it meant to truly live. Rosalind had prepared herself for a marriage of convenience that would provide security at the cost of her independence and authenticity. Instead, she had found a man who valued her intelligence, respected her opinions, and was willing to grow and change alongside her. They had both discovered that the most extraordinary transformations often came disguised as the most ordinary arrangements, and that love could indeed grow from the most unexpected soil when tended by two people willing to be vulnerable, honest, and brave enough to embrace the unknown together. The untamed woman who had arrived at Whitlock Manor had indeed changed the Duke's life forever, not by conforming to his expectations, but by challenging him to exceed them. And in accepting that challenge, Henry had discovered that the greatest adventures were not found in distant lands or grand gestures, but in the daily choice to build something beautiful with another person who was brave enough to dream of a better world and determined enough to help create it. The flowering 6 months after their wedding, the transformation of both Whitlock Manor and its surrounding community had become the talk of the county. What had begun as Henry's attempt to accommodate his unconventional bride's interests had evolved into a comprehensive program of social reform that was attracting attention from progressive thinkers throughout England. The village school had been completely rebuilt, with separate classrooms for different age groups, a well-stocked library, and living quarters for 2 teachers. Miss Hartwell had been joined by a young Oxford graduate named Mr. Peterson, whose enthusiasm for innovative teaching methods matched Rosalind's vision for comprehensive education. The lending library had grown to include not just books, but practical manuals on farming, household management, and basic medicine. But it was the restoration of the still room that had become Rosalind's greatest passion and most significant achievement, working with Mrs. Crawford and several village women who remembered the old remedies. She had recreated her mother-in-law's legendary collection of herbal medicines and household preparations. The still room had become a center of learning and healing, where women from throughout the county came to learn traditional skills and share knowledge. "Your Grace," said Mrs. Patterson, the tenant farmer's wife who had first impressed Rosalind with her garden, I cannot thank you enough for teaching me about the willow bark tea. My husband's rheumatism has improved so much since he began taking it regularly. Rosalind smiled as she carefully labeled a jar of lavender oil. I'm so glad it's helping, Mrs. Patterson. And please remember that you can make the tea yourself now. You don't need to come to me for every preparation. Oh, but I enjoy our lessons so much, and it gives me such confidence to know that I can help my family when they're feeling poorly. This conversation, taking place in the bright, well-organized still room on a crisp October morning, was interrupted by the arrival of Henry, who had taken to visiting his wife's domain regularly to observe her work and discuss the day's activities. "Good morning, ladies," he said with the warm smile that had become his habitual expression since his marriage. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, Your Grace," Mrs. Patterson replied with a curtsy. "Her Grace was just teaching me about preserving herbs for winter use." "An essential skill," Henry agreed seriously, "especially with winter approaching. Mrs. Patterson, how is your husband's new crop rotation working out?" "Wonderfully, Your Grace. The soil seems much healthier, and we're expecting a better yield next year. Her Grace's suggestions about companion planting have made such a difference." After Mrs. Patterson left, Henry moved to stand beside Rosalind at the large wooden table where she was working, admiring both her skill and the peaceful concentration with which she approached her tasks. "You look happy," he observed, noting the contentment in her violet eyes. "I am happy," Rosalind replied, pausing in her work to look up at him. "Happier than I ever imagined possible. This work, this life we're building together, it's everything I dreamed of but never dared to hope for. Even though it means being tied to one estate, one community, you could have married someone with properties throughout England, someone who could have given you a grander stage for your reformist ideas." Rosalind's laugh was musical and utterly content. "Henry, I would rather make a real difference in one community than make a superficial impact in a dozen. What we're doing here, the school, the still room, the agricultural improvements, it's creating lasting change in people's lives. That's worth more than any amount of social prominence." Henry moved closer, his arms encircling her waist as he drew her against him. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "Only twice," Rosalind replied with mock seriousness, "but the day is still young." Their kiss was interrupted by a discreet cough from the doorway, where Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, stood with an expression of fond exasperation. "Forgive me, Your Graces, but you have visitors. Lord and Lady Pemberton have arrived from London, and they've brought several other guests who are eager to see your innovations." Henry and Rosalind exchanged glances. Lord Pemberton was Rosalind's former guardian, and his visits were always somewhat tense affairs. He had never quite forgiven his ward for her unconventional marriage or her continued refusal to behave like a proper duchess. "How many guests?" Rosalind asked, already beginning to remove her work apron. "6, Your Grace. Lord and Lady Pemberton, Sir Charles Whitmore and his wife, and Lord and Lady Ashford. Sir Charles mentioned something about writing an article for the Edinburgh Review about progressive estate management." Rosalind's eyes lit up with interest. "Sir Charles Whitmore, the political economist? Henry, this could be an opportunity to share our methods with a much wider audience, or an opportunity for your former guardian to embarrass us both with his disapproval of your activities," Henry said wryly, though his tone held more amusement than concern. "Lord Pemberton means well," Rosalind said diplomatically. "He simply has very fixed ideas about proper feminine behavior. Fixed ideas that apparently include believing that duchesses should confine themselves to embroidery and charitable tea parties," Henry observed. "Then perhaps it's time to show him that there are other ways to be charitable," Rosalind said with determination. "Shall we go greet our guests?" The reception that followed proved to be both enlightening and entertaining. Lord Pemberton, a stern man in his 60s with decided opinions about proper social behavior, was clearly struggling to reconcile his disapproval of Rosalind's activities with his pride in her elevated social position. "Rosalind, my dear," he said stiffly as she entered the drawing room, "you look, well, though I must say I was surprised to learn that you were not immediately available to receive guests. I trust you were not engaged in anything inappropriate." "I was working in the still room, Lord Pemberton," Rosalind replied calmly, "preparing remedies for the winter months. It's important work that benefits the entire community. Surely such tasks could be delegated to servants," Lady Pemberton interjected with obvious disapproval. "A duchess should not be labouring with her hands like a common apothecary." "On the contrary," said Sir Charles Whitmore, a distinguished gentleman with keen eyes and an air of intellectual curiosity, "I find it refreshing to meet a member of the aristocracy who takes such direct interest in the welfare of her dependents. Your Grace, I understand you have implemented some fascinating innovations in education and agricultural management. Rosalind's face brightened with enthusiasm. Indeed we have, Sir Charles. Would you like to see what we've accomplished? What followed was a comprehensive tour that showcased every aspect of the reforms Henry and Rosalind had implemented. Sir Charles proved to be an eager and knowledgeable observer, asking detailed questions about methods, costs, and results. His wife, an intelligent woman with progressive views, was particularly interested in the stillroom and the educational opportunities being provided to local women. "This is remarkable," Sir Charles said, as they concluded their visit to the rebuilt school. "You've created a model that could be replicated throughout England. The integration of practical and academic education, the focus on community development, the emphasis on empowering individuals to improve their own circumstances, it's exactly the sort of progressive thinking our country needs." "You're too kind, Sir Charles," Henry replied, though he was clearly pleased by the praise. "Not at all. I've been studying estate management and social reform for 20 years, and I've rarely seen such a comprehensive and thoughtful approach. Your Grace," he turned to Rosalind, "I understand that many of these innovations were your ideas. The Duke and I work as partners in all our endeavors," Rosalind replied diplomatically, though her eyes sparkled with pride. "A partnership that clearly benefits everyone involved," Sir Charles observed. "I wonder, would you be willing to document your methods? I believe there would be considerable interest in a detailed account of your reforms." Lord Pemberton, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable throughout the tour, finally spoke up. "Sir Charles, surely you cannot be suggesting that a lady should engage in writing for publication. Such activities are hardly appropriate for a woman of Rosalind's position." "Lord Pemberton," Sir Charles replied with gentle firmness, "I am suggesting that anyone with knowledge and experience that could benefit society has a moral obligation to share that knowledge, regardless of their gender. The Duchess of Whitlock has clearly developed expertise that could help countless other communities. Would you really argue that such knowledge should be suppressed because of arbitrary social conventions? I would argue that a lady's reputation is more important than any intellectual contributions she might make," Lord Pemberton replied stiffly. "Then you would argue for ignorance over enlightenment, for tradition over progress," Sir Charles said with a slight edge to his voice. "Fortunately, not everyone shares such limited views." The tension in the room was palpable until Henry stepped forward with the diplomatic skills that had made him a respected figure in Parliament. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "I believe we all share the same fundamental goal, the improvement of society and the welfare of our fellow citizens. Perhaps we might focus on that common ground, rather than our differences of opinion about methods." "Quite right, Your Grace," Sir Charles agreed, "and I maintain that your methods here at Whitlock are exactly the sort of innovations that could transform English society if they were more widely adopted." That evening, after their guests had retired to their rooms, Henry and Rosalind sat together in their private sitting room, discussing the day's events and their implications. "Sir Charles's offer to help us publish an account of our reforms is intriguing," Rosalind said as she curled up beside Henry on the comfortable sofa they had chosen together. "It could provide a way to share our methods with other communities. It could also provide your former guardian with ammunition for his ongoing campaign to convince you to behave more conventionally," Henry observed. "Are you concerned about Lord Pemberton's disapproval?" Rosalind asked, studying her husband's face. "I'm concerned about anything that might cause you distress," Henry replied honestly, "but I'm not concerned about social disapproval of our methods or your activities. What we're doing here is right, Rosalind. It's making real differences in real lives. That's more important than conventional propriety." Rosalind felt her heart swell with love and gratitude for this man who had not only accepted her unconventional nature, but had embraced it and helped her channel it into meaningful work. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Marrying someone who has brought such complications into your life?" Henry's answer was to draw her into his arms and kiss her with a passion that had only grown stronger over the months of their marriage. "Rosalind," he said when they finally parted, "you have not brought complications into my life. You have brought purpose, meaning, and joy. Before you I was merely existing, going through the motions of being a duke without understanding what that responsibility truly meant. And now I understand that true nobility comes not from birth or title, but from using whatever advantages we have been given to make the world a better place. You taught me that, my love. You showed me what it means to truly live." As they sat together in the comfortable intimacy of their shared life, both reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. Henry had expected a simple, proper bride who would fit neatly into his ordered existence. Instead, he had found a passionate, intelligent woman who had challenged every assumption he held about marriage, leadership, and social responsibility. Rosalind had prepared herself for a marriage of convenience that would provide security at the cost of her independence and authenticity. Instead, she had found a partner who valued her mind, respected her opinions, and was willing to work alongside her to create the kind of life they both wanted to live. Together, they had discovered that the most meaningful transformations often began with the courage to question conventional wisdom, the willingness to see possibilities where others saw only problems, and the determination to build something beautiful and lasting with another person who shared their vision of what life could be. The untamed woman who had arrived at Whitlock Manor had indeed changed the Duke's life forever, but not through conquest or manipulation. She had changed it through the simple but revolutionary act of being authentically herself and inviting him to do the same. And in that mutual authenticity, they had found not just love but purpose, partnership, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using one's gifts in service of something greater than oneself. Their story had become a testament to the transformative power of unexpected love, the importance of intellectual partnership in marriage, and the remarkable things that could be accomplished when two people were brave enough to challenge convention and wise enough to support each other's growth. As autumn deepened into winter, and their first year of marriage drew to a close, Henry and Rosalind knew that they had created something extraordinary together, not just a successful marriage, but a model for how two people could combine their individual strengths to make a lasting difference in the world. The Duke had expected a simple, proper bride, but the untamed woman who had arrived had given him something far more valuable, a life of purpose, passion, and the kind of deep fulfillment that comes from building something meaningful with the person you love most in the world. If this tale of unexpected transformation, intellectual partnership, and the power of authentic love has moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more compelling historical romances. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Rosalind's fearless approach to challenging convention? How did you feel about Henry's transformation from rigid duke to progressive partner? Your engagement helps us continue bringing you stories that explore themes of personal growth, social reform, and the beautiful chaos that can result when two strong-willed people decide to build a life together. Thank you for joining us in this tale of a duke who expected conformity and found revolution, and a woman who refused to be tamed but chose to be loved. And until our next transformative adventure unfolds, remember that the most extraordinary changes often begin with the courage to be authentically yourself and the wisdom to embrace the unexpected gifts that life brings your way.